I'll never forget the day I opened that letter. Right there, in big bold letters, was a demand for $250,000 from an HOA I didn't even know existed. I stood on the porch of my granddad's old ranch house, letter in one hand, disbelief in the other. They claimed I owed fees and fines for violating community rules. Community? What community? This land had been in my family for generations. Pine trees, grazing fields, cattle, and freedom. No fences could hold us in, and certainly no HOA either. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. But when the threats started, liens, court, dates, sheriff visits, I knew they were dead serious. They were so sure they'd squeeze $250,000 out of me and scare me off my own land. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. They didn't know about my granddad's dusty file cabinets full of deeds and old maps. And they definitely didn't know that their shiny new subdivision wasn't fully on their own land. By the time they found out, it was too late. The tables had turned, and the land they built on was mine. This ranch wasn't just a piece of land. It was my family's legacy. My granddad, Henry, bought this spread right after he got back from World War II. He'd saved every dime. He made loading boxcars in the 1940s and bought these acres of rolling fields and tall pines when the county was nothing but farmland and deer trails that I spent every summer out here as a kid. Long, dusty days fixing fences, herding cattle, falling asleep to the chirping of crickets through the old screen door. When my dad passed, Granddad stepped in, taught me how to ride, shoot, fix an engine, and stand my ground. He'd say, "Land's the one thing they ain't making more of, so you protect it like your life depends on it." When Granddad passed at 92, he left it all to me. The house was old, but sturdy. The barn was leaning, but still standing. And the land, well, the land was still perfect. I moved in right after the funeral, not just to keep it running, but to keep his memory alive. That it didn't matter to me that a fancy new gated community had sprouted up down the road. They were city folk, building their cookie-cutter houses where our cattle once grazed. I figured they'd keep to themselves. Turns out, I was dead wrong about that. It started small. A letter in the mailbox with a fancy letterhead, Silver Pines HOA. They claimed my fences were non-compliant. They said my barn violated aesthetic guidelines. I laughed. Who were these people telling me how my barn should look? I tossed the letter. But then came another, and another. They escalated. $500 fine for my unapproved structures. $1,000 for unauthorized livestock. My favorite, $5,000 for failure to landscape in accordance with community standards. I swear, my cattle found that one as funny as I did. One evening, I caught a couple of HOA board members on my driveway, clipboards in hand, looking at my barn like it was an eyesore. I asked them what they were doing trespassing on my land. They told me they were inspecting it for violations. I told them they had about 10 seconds to get back in their Lexus before I called the sheriff for trespassing. They left, but the letters kept coming. Then, one day, a certified letter arrived. $250,000 in back dues, fines, and community maintenance fees. They gave me 30 days to pay, or they'd place a lien on my ranch and take it to court. That night, I sat at Granddad's old desk, stared at that letter, and felt my jaw clench. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to bury them with the truth. The next morning, I climbed up to the attic and dragged down Granddad's old steel filing cabinet. Dusty folders, yellowed deeds, handwritten boundary surveys. This was gold. I spent hours spreading old maps and legal descriptions across the dining table. Turns out, when Granddad bought the ranch, the county was so rural that the original boundary markers were just big oaks and stone piles. In the 70s, the county did a new survey, and there it was in black and white. The property line ran clear through what is now the edge of the Silver Pines development. That I grabbed my boots and a measuring wheel and started walking the old fence lines. My neighbor, Jim, who'd lived next door for 40 years, saw me pacing the field and came over. I showed him the old map. He laughed and said, "You know, I always wondered why they built those fancy backyards so close to the old fence line. Looks like they're right on top of it." Next, I called a local surveyor to come out and mark it professionally. Took him 2 days with his GPS gear and fancy drone. When he was done, he handed me a new map. Sure enough, 3 of their houses, a community playground, and part of their walking trail were smack dab on my land. That night, I poured a whiskey, sat back, and smiled. They wanted to charge me $250,000? Turns out, they owed me way more than that. I scheduled a meeting with the HOA board. They invited me to their polished clubhouse, all granite counters and lemon water in glass pitchers. They probably thought they were about to watch some dumb rancher beg for mercy. They started with pleasantries. The president, a smug guy named Charles, gave me his lawyer's smile. "Mr. Walker, we trust you've reconsidered paying the outstanding fees," he said, sliding a file across the table. I didn't touch it. Instead, I pulled out my new survey map and spread it over their fancy conference table. "Funny you should mention fees," I said. "Turns out you owe me a bit of money." Charles frowned. The board members leaned in. I pointed out each encroachment: their playground, the trail, the 3 houses, all sitting on about 3 acres of my ranch land. Charles turned red. This can't be accurate," he stammered. I showed him the county survey, the deeds, the GPS report. I told him I'd already talked to my lawyer and had paperwork ready for a trespass and unlawful occupation lawsuit. One of the board members asked if we could work this out quietly. I leaned back, folded my arms, and told them that depended entirely on how fast they planned to write me a check or get ready to bulldoze their pretty playground. After that meeting, I gave them a week to think it over. Charles called 3 days later, voice all syrupy sweet. He asked if we could meet again. I agreed, but this time, it was at my place. When they pulled up to my dusty driveway in their shiny SUVs, I greeted them by the old barn, the one they wanted torn down. I made coffee. We sat at a picnic table under the big oak, and I laid out my terms. First, they'd drop every single fine and fee, obviously. Second, they'd pay me rent for every square foot they'd built on. My lawyer helped me calculate back rent for the years they'd illegally used it, plus damages. It came out to nearly $400,000. Third, they'd build a proper privacy fence so none of their kids wandered onto my land again. Charles tried to haggle. He said they could only do half. I told him I'd love to let a judge decide instead, and maybe we'd bulldoze a few backyards in the process. They folded. 2 weeks later, I stood on my porch again. Same spot I'd opened that first letter, and this time, I opened a cashier's check. Full amount. Paid in full. I called Jim, my neighbor, and we had a beer to celebrate. The best part? A month later, I watched as a crew tore down part of their precious playground. It was just enough to remind them that this rancher's fence line was no joke. Granddad would have loved it, and probably laughed harder than anyone. After the check cleared, the HOA never bothered me again. They rewrote their bylaws to make sure they never tried claiming my land as theirs again. They even sent out letters to their residents clarifying the new boundary rules, which was just HOA speak for "don't mess with that rancher next door." I rebuilt my old fence, nice and sturdy. Put up some clear markers with shiny new signs: private property, no trespassing. I even let Jim run a few head of cattle through that corner just to make the point. The best part was seeing those fancy folks complain about how their kids couldn't play on their trail anymore. Sorry, neighbors. Maybe next time you'll read the plat maps before you pour concrete. That I'd gotten my money, my land, and my peace of mind back. I knew Granddad was looking down, proud that I'd done exactly what he'd taught me. Stand up for your land, no matter who tries to push you around. The old ranch was safe for another generation. And you better believe I'm teaching my kids exactly where every fence post sits and how to keep nosy neighbors on their own side of it. If there's one thing this whole mess taught me, it's that you can't just roll over when someone tries to bully you, even if they show up with fancy lawyers and a big shiny HOA sign. Land is power. It's history. It's family. And once you let someone chip away at it, they'll keep coming until they've taken it all. So you fight. Smart. You keep your papers in order, you know your rights, and you stand your ground, no matter how loud they get. People like Charles and his HOA thought they could steamroll the little guy. They thought they could slap some fines on me, scare me, and get rich off my ranch. But they didn't count on me digging through old boxes and fighting back with facts.so. If you've got something worth protecting, protect it. Stand up for yourself. And if someone tries to take what's yours, make sure they regret it so badly they'll never try again. And if Granddad's watching, I hope he's smiling, knowing the ranch is still ours. Always will be.